Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. As we're now officially into the start of autumn, I thought today would be the perfect day to share some of my favourite autumnal reads with you all. As you can see, I've got the fire crackling, I've got my cup of tea, and I'm feeling really cosy and autumnal today. It's pouring with rain outside at the moment, so I'm sitting in the kitchen. I've had the fire going since breakfast time, so it's lovely and cosy in here by the afternoon. I've got my jumper on and I'm just feeling thoroughly cosy. So I can't wait to share some of my favourite cosy, also rather spooky reads for you that I think are just perfect to curl up with in the colder months. So let's dive in. Well, first of all, you probably already know that I love The Fortnight in September by R.C. Sheriff, and I think this is a wonderful book to read every September. It's one of my favourite books published by Persephone Books. My mum and I chose this as our book club choice for the Tea and Tattle Book Club, and you can watch our video where we chat about this book, so I won't share too much about it today, but I think it's a perfect book to enjoy just as summer ends and autumn begins, because it's about a family holiday, an annual family holiday that they always take to the seaside. It's about very typical middle class, lower middle class even, English family and their trip to the seaside every September. The book, although it's a really heartwarming read, is also tinged with a little bit of melancholy, and I feel that that also is part of what makes it a perfect read for the start of autumn and when the year is starting to draw to its close. Next, this is one of my very favourite books too, especially to read in the autumn, and it's The Shooting Party by Isabel Colgate. This book, in fact, inspired Gosford Park and Downton Abbey, so if you like that sort of period drama, then you absolutely would love this book. It's a really slim read too, so it's perfect to just curl up with one cosy evening. And this book is set just before World War I. It's the last autumn before World War I begins. So again, it's tinged with that sense of melancholy, of foreboding, of how the world will completely change forever for the characters in this novel. It was written in the 1970s, but like I said, it's set just before World War I. And it's about a shooting party that takes place in a big country mansion. And what was unusual at the time that this book was published was that Isabel Colgate really wrote about the characters downstairs, as well as all of the shenanigans happening upstairs in the house. So you get the servants' perspective as well as the members of the shooting party's perspective. There's a tragedy that occurs right at the end of the novel, so there's a lot of foreshadowing and the novel sort of builds up to its climax. But I really enjoyed it. I think, again, it's an enchanting sort of insight into this lost world, and it just is a brilliant book to read in the autumn. Another favourite of mine that I tend to reread every September is September by Rosamund Pilcher. I'm listening to this on Audible at the moment. I always love having an audiobook on the go, and this is the one that I'm listening to right now. I adore Rosamund Pilcher's books. This one, although it starts in May, it works up to September and to a big ball that is taking place in Scotland. Much of the novel is set in Scotland, and I think that's part of the reason why I love to read it in the autumn. Somehow I always think of Scotland as being the perfect autumnal destination. I think it's because of the idea of, you know, the hunts and the beautiful Highland scenery, tartan, cosy teas by the fire, all that sort of thing that I always just think about when I think of Scotland. And so I love the fact that a lot of this book is set in Scotland. Rosamund Pilcher lived in Scotland for quite a bit of her life. She knew that area very well. And if you love The Shell Seekers by her, then this is a brilliant book to read next, because one of the characters from The Shell Seekers, Penelope's son, in fact pops up in September again. He's not a very likeable character at all in The Shell Seekers, but he is redeemed somewhat in this book. So that's rather a nice touch to the story as well. But yes, I love cozying up with this book in the autumn. It's a great read. And then another favourite writer of mine is Barbara Pym. And Quartet in autumn, well, of course you have to read that in autumn, don't you? It's one of her most famous books, along with Excellent Women. I would say Quartet in autumn is one of her best known books, and it's a brilliant example of her style of writing. She really did write a lot about middle class, often solitary, sort of single women and men. And she just has such an incredibly keen eye for human nature. Her themes of loneliness and living a life of solitude really do crop up in this book. She writes a lot about what life is like in middle age and in older age as well. And she does that so well in this. And I think it's those themes of loneliness, solitude and aging that actually make this book a really great autumn read. Because again, it's got that slight air of melancholy to the story that I think just fits so well with this season. There is a touch of hope at the end too, and what saves her writing from becoming too sad, I think, is that she also has a brilliant sense of humour, and that's a real joy to reading her books. So if you've never read any Barbara Pym, then I do recommend trying Quartet in autumn at some point in the weeks ahead, but also do reread it. It's a lovely reread at this time of year if you're already familiar with it. Now, there's nothing I like more than cozying up with a golden age mystery in the colder months. I adore Dorothy L. Sayers, and The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club is a brilliant read for autumn because the murder actually takes place on Armistice Day in November. This is a Lord Peter Wimsey mystery. It's pre-Harriet Vane days, so it's one of the ones that just has him as the main character, and Bunter, of course, his manservant. But it's a really enjoyable mystery. Like I said, she's one of my favourite Golden Age crime writers, and I really recommend this one for the autumn months. Then one of my favourite novels of all time, Jane Austen's Persuasion. I look forward to this book as a treat that is just waiting for me every October. For some reason, that's my favourite month in which to reread this, and I either listen to it on audio or I actually read the physical copy, but one or the other, I do it every year. I adore this book, and again, it's Jane Austen's last novel. I think it is her most mature work, her last completed novel, I should say. And there is that air, again, of some sadness, some melancholy, but also there's a real maturity to the heroine in this book, to Anne Elliot. And that lends itself very well to an autumnal read. There's a very memorable scene in the book too, when Anne takes a walk and she recalls to mind some famous quotes about the autumn that poets have made. And it's a lovely scene in the book. That's one of the reasons too why I think it's such a lovely autumnal read. Again, it is a bit about aging and about loneliness as well. Anne Elliot is almost on the shelf for women in those days. She's 27. She's trying to come to terms with the fact that she was persuaded to give up the love of her life as a young woman. And she's trying to find her own happiness, I think, as a single woman. But the chance at love comes back into her life. And it just is such a beautiful, such a moving read, and I absolutely adore it. So yes, one of my favourite books to read every autumn. This is another great autumnal choice. Not all of the book is set in the autumn, but there are some great autumnal scenes to this book. It's The Bookshop by Penelope Fitzgerald. I love Penelope Fitzgerald's writing. I think she is such an interesting writer. Again, this book is following some similar themes. It's about aging. It's about a woman who is left on her own. She's just been recently widowed. So it's about leading quite a solitary life, and I love this book. It's a strange book in some ways. Again, I think it's a good autumnal read because there's a definite quality of sadness to the story. It's about a woman who finally decides to sort of pursue her dream of running her own bookshop, and she sets up a bookshop in a town, I think it's set in East Anglia, and she sets up the bookshop in this small town that's never had a bookshop before. But unfortunately, she comes up against some very officious personalities in the town, and her bookshop isn't the roaring success at all that she thought it would be. But this is a lovely read if you love books. If you dream of starting a bookshop, this might be a bit of a reality check, let's be honest, but I think so many of us can sympathise with the woman in this. And there's also a poltergeist that haunts her bookshop and home. So in that way too, it's actually quite a good autumn read because there's a bit of a supernatural presence in this book, which I enjoyed as well. I haven't seen the film. There was recently a film made of The Bookshop too, which I haven't seen. Judging by the trailer, it looks quite different from the actual book, but I would still like to see it. It probably would be quite a good film to choose to watch one autumn evening. So I hope to do that at some point too, but read the book as well. I recommend it. And then another book about a woman running a bookshop, which is a really good pick for the autumn, is The Bookseller by Cynthia Swanson. Halloween is actually quite an important day in this novel, and it's got a lot of twists and turns to the plot, which also make it a really good autumn read. It's about a fairly young woman who is running a bookshop with her friend. I think it's set in the 1960s, and she thinks that she's very content with her life. She enjoys the life of being single. She's proud of the business that she's created, but she starts having very strange dreams. She goes to bed, and it seems almost as though she wakes up in this alternate reality where in fact she's married and has children. And this seeming dream world almost becomes more real to her than her real life. And it starts making her question her life choices and what she actually wants out of life. It's a bit like, if you've seen the film Sliding Doors, it's a bit like Sliding Doors, only also set in a bookshop, which gives it a lot of added charm, I think. And there's a brilliant twist to the story at the end. And I do love books with a good twist. Somehow, especially in the autumn, I enjoy a sort of twisty-turny type of tale. And so I really recommend this one. Yeah, I think it was a great read. Now, this is a book I actually haven't read yet, but it is on my to-be-read pile for October, and it's The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This is meant to be one of the very best ghost stories. So I'm excited to read it, especially as I absolutely adored We Have Always Lived in the Castle by the same author. I read that early in the start of the summer, and it absolutely blew me away. I thought it was amazing. And since then, I've really been wanting to read The Haunting of Hill House, but I thought it would make a great kind of Halloween read. So I'm actually going to read it in October. And I hope I get through it, because I have to admit, I'm completely wimpy when it comes to scary books. I never read horror. I can't watch horror films. And I, in fact, couldn't even finish The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. I just got so frightened frightened when I was reading it that I just had to stop. So let's see how I get on with this. If you've read it, let me know how scary it is. I'm going to try and finish it though. I'm going to try and be brave, but I don't think I could watch the film. I think that would actually be too hard for me, but let's see how I get on with it. So I'm a bit nervous, but looking forward to it. Another brilliant classic to read in the autumn is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I return to this book almost every autumn. I have it as an audiobook, and I also love to reread the physical book. Same with Jane Eyre. I in fact just finished listening to Jane Eyre in September. That's such a good autumnal read too. But my favourite Bronte book is actually The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and I think it's one of the most underrated classics. I think it's an extraordinary early feminist book, and it's also quite unusual in that it actually looks at a marriage rather than just the lead up to the wedding. You know, this book doesn't finish with the wedding, it almost begins with a wedding. And then it's also really unusual in that, well, for the time especially, in that it shows a bad marriage. And the woman in it ends up having to flee from her sort of drunken, abusive husband. She takes her child away from him. She in fact does find love again, but it's a bit of a tortuous path for her. And it's just such a good read. I can't recommend it highly enough. The book is also predominantly set in October and November, so it's a really great read for the autumn. If you've never read it, then please do decide to read it this autumn, because it's one of my favourite books. A great spooky sort of tale, if you want a bit of Halloween reading inspiration, is The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell. This is all of the sort of great Gothic type of tropes, but actually done really well in it. There's a hint of female madness. Is the main character insane, or is she not? There's haunting. There's a very spooky house in it, and a ghostly presence as well. So I read this last autumn, in fact, before I interviewed the author, and I really recommend it. I love all of Laura Purcell's books, and in fact, The Corset by her is one of my very, very favourites too. But if you want more of a traditional sort of ghost story, then I really recommend The Silent Companions. It's set in the Victorian times as well, which I love. So yes, if you want a kind of Gothic-y, spooky sort of story, then try this one. It will really keep you turning the pages, and yeah, I recommend it. And then I love the Sherlock Holmes books, and The Hound of the Baskervilles is one of my favourite books to read in the autumn too. But I know loads of people love Sherlock Holmes, so for something a bit different, I wanted to recommend The House of Silk by Anthony Horowitz. And this is a Holmes and Watson story that he's written, and I think he's done a really good job. It's set in November. Well, it starts off in November when poor Dr. Watson, I think, is suffering either from flu or a really bad cold. I can't remember. But he and Sherlock Holmes are at the tea table, and of course then a client calls. But I really enjoyed it. I wasn't, I have to admit, completely satisfied by the ending. However, it was a real page turner. It's a good autumnal sort of read, and I think he did a good job, especially with Dr. Watson. I thought he wrote Dr. Watson very convincingly. Sherlock Holmes less so, in my opinion, but I think in terms of sort of fan fiction, he's actually done a really good job with Holmes and Watson. And if you're a big Sherlock Holmes fan, then I would recommend picking this up and giving it a go. Then last autumn, during October, I started reading one of the ghost stories of Edith Wharton every night, or sort of every 2 nights. I'd read one of the ghost stories. And this was a tradition actually that I started, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, that each autumn I like to buy or at least reread a ghost story collection. And I sort of read a short story every night during October, something like that, and sometimes into November too. And it's one of my favourite things to do this time of year, as long as I don't frighten myself too much last thing at night with a ghost story, which occasionally I've been known to do. But I really love Edith Wharton's ghost stories. They're really brilliant, and this is a fabulous collection. Also, I have to point out the bats on this cover. I don't know if you can see it, but it's one of those things that at first I didn't realise they were bats, and then once you see it, you can't unsee it. But I think that it's a brilliant cover. I just love this, one of the Virago Modern Classics. And yes, there's some really good spooky ghost stories in this, but not too scary if you're a bit of a wimp like I am. Really enjoyable though. And then another brilliant sort of Victorian Gothic story is The Confessions of Fanny Lankton by Sarah Collins. I interviewed Sarah Collins, I think it was last year, about this book. And yes, it's one of my favourites to read in the autumn. There are lots of sort of good autumnal and wintry scenes to this book, but again, it has a lot of those Gothic tropes in fiction, but she really makes them her own. Sarah Collins, she does a brilliant job of sort of upending some of those tropes and writing a really original story, which is fantastic. Fanny Lankton, the eponymous heroine, is a former slave who has come from Jamaica to London. And when you meet her at the start of the novel, she is in fact on trial for the murder of her master and mistress. She worked as a maid in a big London household, and both the master and mistress were killed. She's being tried for their murder, and finally she gets the chance to tell her side of the story. So this goes from Jamaica to London, covering Fanny's life, and she's blocked some of the horrific events that have just happened, but as she starts to tell and to write down her story, she starts to remember exactly what happened to her mistress. And it's just a really engrossing page turner. I really recommend it as a brilliant autumn read. Then another famous classic. I think this book is always on people's list for good autumn reads, but particularly this year. If you haven't read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, then do. There's a new Netflix film that is coming out in October. I'm really excited to see it. I've seen the trailer and I actually think it looks really good, so I'm excited to watch it, and it's made me want to reread Rebecca. It's my favourite Daphne du Maurier book, although I also love My Cousin Rachel, but this is such a classic, so do read it if you haven't yet. Then another book that I think is a fantastic autumn choice is The 13th Tale by Diane Zetterfield. This actually starts in November and it's such a twisty, turny tale. I love it. There's a twist at the end of this that I didn't see coming. I really enjoyed it. Funnily enough, the heroine in it also works in a bookshop. So that's rather a nice connection to some of the other books I've recommended as good autumn reads. But she's surprised when she's contacted by a famous writer, a female novelist who is very secretive about her past life, but she's decided that she wants to tell it. And she wants our heroine to hear the story and to write her biography. And the story that is told is really remarkable. And again, it features a great sort of crumbling house in the English countryside. There's lots of twists and turns, like I've said, to the tale. There's an evil twin and a good twin. So it's just, oh, it's such a good read. I know it's a favourite of many people's, but yeah, if you haven't read the 13th Tale, then autumn is a brilliant time to read it. It's a sort of book that keeps you up at night because you just want to keep reading and knowing what happens at the end. So do read it, and read it with a cup of hot chocolate. The heroine is always having hot chocolate in this book. So yes, you're going to want to make yourself a hot chocolate when you're reading this, or at least I did. But any excuse for a hot chocolate, I think, is good. So it's perfect for me. Right, I've also chosen a few non-fiction and sort of anthologies as well that I think would be perfect for autumn. This is a lovely anthology, Autumn, an anthology for the changing seasons, edited by Melissa Harrison. This is a collection of diary extracts, poetry, short stories, essays, all about autumn, and it's a lovely book to have by your bedside as we go into autumn. My mum, in fact, has this book by her bedside at the moment, and I know she's really enjoying dipping in and out of it every evening. And it's just such a nice way, I think, to mark a new season and to appreciate the season that much more, is by reading some brilliant extracts about autumn. There's some lovely poems in this too. So I really recommend this. It's part of a quartet, actually, edited by Melissa Harrison for each season. And they make a really nice set, but autumn is one of my favourites, I think. I really love this anthology. And then, you know how much I love poetry. I love reading a poem a day, or at least one poem a day, normally two. And so this I had to get. It's a poem for every autumn day. And I love, I think they're taken from the nature poems for every day of the year and every night of the year. And I have those poetry volumes, but I also really wanted this anthology. For one thing, it looks gorgeous. It's got such a beautiful autumnal cover, which I love. And also I like that it's a bit slimmer, it's a bit less heavy to hold up in bed when I want to read a poem a day from it. And each poem just evokes autumn in some beautiful way. And again, it's just a lovely volume to help you appreciate the season even more, I think. And it's a great way to get into poetry. If you'd like to read a bit more poetry, then reading a poem a day about the season that you're in is actually, I think, a lovely thing to do. So yes, I really recommend it. This was quite new out. I hope they go on to do winter, spring and summer as well, because I think it's such a lovely idea. And then, if you want to read a bit about the nature of autumn, then The Nature of Autumn by Jim Crumley is a lovely read. Again, this is part of a quartet. He's also written The Nature of Winter, Spring and Summer, but autumn is a lovely one. At the beginning, he starts out explaining why leaves change their colour and fall. But he's just such a great writer, I think, Jim Crumley, that even when he's explaining quite a scientific process, for instance, he still manages to make it really accessible and also just enjoyable reading, which is something that I appreciate. So this is a lovely book and I highly recommend it too. Then we all like to get our knitting needles out at this time of year, I think. So The Mindfulness in Knitting by Rachel Matthews, Meditations on Craft and Calm, is, I think, a lovely companion at this time. And if you want a bit of knitting inspiration, then I think that this book would help you get into it. So really recommend this one. And then finally, I adore this book. It's The Ghost, A Cultural History by Susan Owens. And it's a great look at ghosts throughout English literature and why ghosts have been so important within literature and within sort of the wider culture in Britain over the centuries. It's a fascinating insight into literature generally, into why ghosts are so important, and it's also beautifully illustrated. There are some lovely examples of paintings, and it's just a really interesting read that I really recommend. I was actually astonished by how much I enjoyed this book, and it's one I would like to reread because it taught me so much, so really recommend it. But those are all of my choices for autumn. I hope you enjoyed my suggestions. Do let me know what you're going to be reading over the months ahead. Are you a seasonal reader? Have you got any great autumn picks ahead of you? Let me know, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, which you can do by clicking my face that pops up over here. But thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back again very soon with another video. Happy autumn and happy reading. Bye!